Welcome to the Arrive podcast, the U.S. Immigration Law podcast for Canadians. Today we will be discussing sponsorship for a green card. First, we're going to talk about who can sponsor somebody, or you. If you're trying to come to the United States, you're not a U.S. citizen, well, who can sponsor you? And I think that's how it's phrased when we hear it most of the time. People call and say, hey, I want to go to the U.S. How do I get there? Who can sponsor me? And the other thing we're going to talk about is what are the financial obligations of that sponsor? Because there are financial obligations as well. It goes beyond just meeting the relationship requirements to sponsor somebody. There's also a financial aspect of it.
Right, and there's a limited list of people that can fill in as your sponsor.
Very limited.
Yeah.
People think, and I think, how often do we get this call? Frequently. But they say, I want to go to the U.S. How do I get there? Who can sponsor me to the U.S.?
Or I have family in the United States. Can they sponsor me? Well, we're going to go through the list of who qualifies to be your sponsor.
Or can I just sponsor myself?
Right.
Right? And then that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah.
But in very limited situations, that can happen. But in this situation we're talking about is family sponsorship for a green card. Which family members qualify to sponsor somebody to come into the United States? And the first thing you look at is relationship, because that's how it's built. The U.S. immigration system is built based on qualifying familial relationships.
And the reason for that is the whole purpose of allowing family members to sponsor you is for family reunification. So the whole purpose of that part of the immigration system is to keep family units together. They think it's a good purpose. I do too. To try to keep families as a unit and not just have independent people living in the United States, breaking apart families, people with no support group. That's never good for anybody. So that's the purpose, family reunification.
Well, and when you put it in that perspective, they have classified certain family members as top priority. And those top priority individuals, and we can start there for sponsorship, the top priority, the people they want to keep together are children and their parents. Mm-hmm. So minor children and parents are top priority, as well as parents of U.S. citizens. They have a special category where they have priority.
And spouses as well fall into that.
And spouses.
So
Not spouses. Spouses, parents, and minor children all have a special category. Because most categories fall under the Department of State visa issuance guidelines, and they only issue so many a year. So these ones we're talking about don't fall under the...
There's no limits on the amount of visas they can issue for spouses. There's no limit on the amount they can issue for parents of U.S. citizens
or
minor children of U.S. citizens. There's no limit on that.
While the other ones might have a longer wait time because there is a limit on those individuals. For example, if you become an adult child, you're not seen as a priority as a minor child because they see you as being able to take care of yourself. If you're married,
right, so exactly. So if you think about it in terms of self-sufficiency, a 21-year-old is someone, that's where the cutoff is, and that's what they say at that point. You're no longer a minor child. Now you're a 21-year-old. So if you're stuck in your home country for a while, they're not so concerned about you being separated from your parents.
But that's something you need to take into account when you're thinking about this process is what are the ages of my children? Right? Maybe you have a 17-year-old or 18-year-old child, 20-year-old child, and once they turn 21, you're on your own.
Yeah, and sadly, with a lot of these categories, it can take years and years and years to get to the point where a visa is available for your family members. Sometimes if you have children, they may be minors when you start this process. They could even be little when you start this process. But by the time a visa is available, they age out.
Category.
Yeah.
Or maybe you get married, then that also jumps you to a different category.
Changes category, or the child ages out, and the rest of the family can move forward with their green card, but the child that was a minor at the time they started the process is now 21, and they're no longer eligible. So you've got to keep that in mind. Make sure you work with somebody who's tracking these dates and is able to help you with that and make a plan for
And they change every month. So
they do, yeah.
It's subject to what's called the visa bulletin.
Or should we say they don't change every month?
Sometimes they go forward or they go backward. They don't change at all. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
But for example, it came out just this week. So we had to go and we had to verify what pending cases we had and who was in what category. And some of our people became eligible to get their green card now. so they're able to move on to the next step.
And some of our people aged out of their eligibility for their green card because it didn't move forward quickly enough. Sadly.
Or some of them went farther back and have to wait even longer.
Right.
Because that's the way it works sometimes.
Yeah, so let's talk about who these people are. So if you're in Canada or in another country and you think, hey, I've got some family in the U.S., I wonder if they can just file some papers for me and maybe I can come to the United States and get a green card and citizenship eventually. So the first person that can sponsor you, and one of those priority ones, is your spouse. So if you have a spouse who is a U.S. citizen or even a green card holder in the United States, they can sponsor you to come to the U.S. and join them. The process is one, if you're a citizen of the United States sponsoring someone, you get that priority level where you're not going to have to wait. But if you are a green card holder sponsoring your spouse from another country, there could possibly be a wait period, so you have to be careful with that.
But yes, a spouse, U.S. citizen.
Top priority.
What about a child? Can my child sponsor me?
Right, so a U.S. citizen can sponsor their parent, absolutely. They need to be 21 years old when they start the process. They can't file anything before that. So if you have a 17-year-old that's an American citizen, son or daughter, they have to wait till that 21st birthday. We see this often
because of cross-border life here. Plus people come as maybe students or they came here working and they had a child while they were in the U.S. So they're like, hey, can my child sponsor me? My child's 3. No, your minor child cannot, but your adult child,
right, you just have to wait a few years and it could happen for you. So we do have a lot of people that call us right as their son or daughter's turning 21 and they say, we've been waiting for, we lived in the U.S. briefly. We had a child there way back 21 years ago, and now he or she just turned 21 and we would like to resume living in the United States. We're going to have our son or daughter sponsor us. This is also referred to negatively, and I don't appreciate the negative connotation, as the anchor baby. So this would be where somebody has a child in the U.S. and then they can use that U.S. born child to sponsor family members outside the United States in the future.
And you do, unfortunately, we do have people call once in a while, hey, I'm about to have a child in the U.S., how does this child sponsor me? So it does happen negatively as well, and that's where it comes from.
But most of the cases we deal with,
they're legitimate people working
here in the U.S.,
studying and living in the U.S., and as part of their life they have a child.
Right.
And there's certain benefits that at the right time they can get through that child because it's a U.S. citizen.
Absolutely. And so, sponsoring a parent, it doesn't have to be right when you turn 21. You can do it at any point in your life. So
I'd say most of them happen when they're adults and married, then they end up sponsoring a parent later on down the road.
Yeah, like when the parents retire in their home country and they say, hey, I want to come and live with you and the grandkids now, and then you can sponsor your parent.
Or a child who was an adult when they came to the U.S., they went to school, got married, whatever it might be, obtained citizenship.
And my parents
somehow.
are elderly and I need to bring them so I can care for them in the United States. That's another, good case scenario that we see a lot.
Yeah. So you can be sponsored by a spouse and an adult child. Who else can sponsor you?
So you can be sponsored by a spouse, an adult child. You can also sponsor your child, right? So if you're a U.S. citizen and you have a son or daughter, you can sponsor them. So it's not just a U.S. citizen sponsoring parent. There's 2 different categories,
right? There's a minor child and an adult child.
Right.
We already talked that the minor children have special rules that apply to them because they're a minor and they want to keep them with their parents. Where an adult child, the adult child might take a little bit longer, but you can sponsor that. You can also be sponsored by a brother or sister who's a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, I sponsored my brother back in 2009. He's still waiting.
Family reunification for a sibling is not a top priority.
Definitely not a top priority.
So depending on the country, you could be waiting 20 years.
You could be, even longer.
So the wait time is much higher for a brother or sister, and a married brother or sister has another category like an adult child.
No, they don't actually.
Or adult child that's married.
Surprisingly, they don't have another category. So what happens with the brother and sister is there's no separate category for married or unmarried. But when I sponsored my brother, he was a single guy back in 2009. He was a bachelor. He's since been married and had a child. So now where he was going to take up 1 visa, if they had processed it back then, now he's going to need 3 visas for this family member.
That's
because
where
you're allowed to add
back and forth.
In some of these cases, you can add your family members onto as we call them derivatives on the case. And so his wife and his son will be able to join along with his case in the United States to come once there is a visa available for just him. So that's how the backlogs are created too, though.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because if you see one
when you
visa,
have an adult child too, the same thing applies, right?
right? And so as these timelines get longer, people's lives change, and they seem to get more and more kids and wives and whatnot, and more visas are taken up by these one sponsorship situations. So those timelines are only getting longer. They don't seem to be getting any shorter.
Yep. An adult child was the one I was talking about. An adult child that gets married goes to a different category.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's a good point. Life happens, people get married, people have children, and then circumstances change, and that impacts this process. Who else can sponsor you? What about my aunt or uncle? I have a lot of aunties in the United States.
No, your cousins, aunts, and uncles, unfortunately, are not eligible. Grandparents, too. So a lot of people call and say, my grandfather was a U.S. citizen, and he lives in the U.S., and I'd like him to sponsor me. I want to go to school there. They can't sponsor you. So U.S. citizen grandparents are not going to work.
So an immediate relative is, by U.S. immigration, is defined as a mother, father, spouse, brother, sister, or child.
Right.
Any relationship outside of that does not qualify for sponsorship. Now, when you're talking about a grandparent, we talked about this on a previous podcast, they may not be able to sponsor you, but depending on the chain between your parents and your grandparents, there may be another avenue. Maybe you could get citizenship through that grandparent. So, however, they cannot sponsor. So, for the purpose of this discussion, no sponsorship from grandparent.
Yeah.
And there's other things you need to consider too. So those are the relationships. Those are the ones that qualify.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the individuals. If you're looking to come to the United States and you have that relationship in the U.S., if you have a U.S. citizen, spouse, parent, brother, sister, adult child, well, then there's a possibility they can sponsor you.
And I typically, when I talk to people, and even though the wait is very long, so for example, 14 years for my brother right now, what I usually tell people is it's a minimal investment for you to make right now and get that application in. You don't know where your life's going to be in 14 years. You may be glad that you have an ability to get a green card at that time. And if you're not, you can always just abandon the process. There's nobody going to force you to get it. But you leave your options and the doors open to you. I mean, even if you come to the U.S. in another way, in the meantime, you may come in another way that doesn't have a path to a green card. So you've got this option in the background.
And this, when we see this quite often, where, for example, and we've done several of these cases, somebody comes and they get an investor visa in the U.S. and they open a business, but then they have a sibling who's a U.S. citizen, and the sibling does a sponsorship for a green card through their relationship with that sibling, but the wait time's 15 years. So in the meantime, what do? Well, they open up a business, they come here on what's called an investor or an e-visa, and they work in the U.S., managing their investment, working while that green card process is in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Then when their number comes up, then they switch from that investor visa over to a green card, and now they can stay here forever because now they're a permanent resident. It also happens with individuals that come on maybe an L visa or a TN visa or a student visa, where they have a temporary status that they use in the meantime, and there's ways to do that where you can be here temporarily and extending and changing your visa status while you wait for that green card to be called up.
Yes, definitely. So you can get your life in the U.S. started before you're eligible for the green card, but it's pending in the background and doesn't impact your ability to get a temporary visa.
Yeah, if done correctly, you can hold a temporary visa while you're waiting for this to process in the background. They're separate processes. And people don't often understand that. They are completely separate. So one of them can be filed concurrently with the other one.
Yes.
And it can be done in the background.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you have to be careful. There are considerations such as immigrant intent, which we've discussed in the past. You can only hold certain intent while you're on certain visas, and filing for a green card can change your intent. So it can be done, and I think that's very important to consider and think about when you're talking about sponsorship, because you don't always have this relationship readily available where a spouse or a parent can immediately sponsor you to come over with no wait time. And
yeah, you may only have a brother or sister, or
or maybe you have a child who you're waiting to become an adult.
Yeah.
So you need a Band-Aid in the meantime to get here to work and to do what you want to do. So there are other ways that you can do that, especially
in
as
some
a Canadian.
instances, not for every single person, but
if you're going to invest or do business or work in the U.S., you might have something that's going to get you here in the meantime while you wait for these green card situations to work themselves out.
Right, so if you have a sponsor, now you may be wondering, hey, you know, I want to ask my brother or sister to sponsor me. What's the obligation on that sponsor? You know, there's a financial aspect to this, which you have to take into consideration as well. Maybe you have more than one family member that can sponsor you, and you're trying to figure out who's the best one to choose from. Should it be mom? Should it be dad? Who should I pick to be my sponsor?
Yeah, and the financial sponsor requirements are set forth in what's called the Federal Poverty Guidelines by the U.S. government, and that's published every year. And it starts with 2 people, and each individual that's added, it goes up.
Right, so that there's an obligation there on the part of the U.S.
Obligation.
A financial obligation, because they don't want people coming to the United States without any a financial support network, right? Because it's hard for a new immigrant to the U.S. to come here and start. Maybe they don't speak the language, they don't have the job qualifications necessary. So the U.S. government wants to ensure that there's somebody here in the United States that's going to be on the hook and going to be responsible for you, help you out financially.
You're not going to become what's called a public charge, right. In other words, dependent on the U.S. government.
And the way they ensure that is they include a form in this application package that you file that shows and puts somebody signing off on a contract saying, yes, I'm going to be responsible for this new immigrant to the United States. So if they ever, get welfare, or they ever get, public funds and assistance, the obligation on the sponsor is that the federal government could sue them and ask for that money back.
For reimbursement of those funds.
Reimbursement. Yeah. So have you ever seen that happen in your career?
No. I think that's very low priority on the government's list. If you look at the news, follow the news right now, they're looking at reimbursement for people that aren't even citizens. So that doesn't happen. So, but it is a requirement. So financial sponsorship is something that they look at. It's very important. I would,
right.
In my experience,
you can't just squeak through on this.
You cannot.
Without good evidence. It needs to be done properly.
So these cases, especially if you're outside of the country, they're split into 2 different phases. So you can get the first step of the process approved. So Christine sponsors me as her father to come to the United States. She shows the birth certificate, the marriage certificate, and everything to prove that the relationship is real. So as her father, I get approved. So the first step's approved. Well, then it gets sent to the National Visa Center, and we deal with Canada, so we'll use Montreal for processing. At that point is when they will now do additional verifications, which include this financial verification. So even though a lot of people get excited, oh, I've been approved. Well, great, that's great,
yeah,
but that's the first step.
The second step's almost harder, I think, than the first step. So
you have the medical check you have to pass. You have the financial check you have to pass.
And the financial
the background check you have to pass.
The financial part is complicated. So you have to look at the finances of the sponsor, the person who's sponsoring you, and the first thing we usually check is, do they have U.S. source income of a certain amount? 125% of the federal poverty guideline. What does that amount to? So typically for a couple of, for just 2 people in the household, it could be around, $22,000, $23,000.
And it changes every year.
Per year.
Yeah.
So if you have an income of that amount, you don't want to be borderline. So the more you make, the better above that. But if the sponsor has U.S. source income, that means U.S. employers paying them a paycheck for their services or labor, then that meets the requirement. And it amounts to that much annually.
And what if you don't have U.S.-based income?
If you don't have U.S.-based income, say for example you're a married couple and you're living in Canada and you haven't worked in the United States, you don't have any U.S. source income, we can look at your assets. So the assets of the U.S. person, what do they amount to? So for a married couple, you would have to show that those assets amount to at least 3 times the amount that's required. So if you're just a couple, 2 people, and they want to see $24,000, you're going to have to show 3 times that amount in assets.
And assets are
so
liquid,
to
or just something that's quickly turned to liquid.
And that's USD. So
yes.
That's in our local currency, not in.
But we know
Canadian
how the real estate market is over there in Canada. So a lot of people are sitting on this nice
Well, they have equity
golden
in their
egg
home.
on their home.
Yeah,
so.
you got to be careful with that too. You got to provide the right evidence and make sure you're going to get an appraisal done of your home, which not many people want to do because that costs money. So, but the evidence needs
So
to be
you can
there.
use assets
Use assets
if needed, and we see that very often because a lot of our clients are living in Canada and they don't have U.S. based income.
Mhm.
And so they have to rely on those assets.
Right, so you want to make sure you work with someone who's familiar with that. Now, what if you don't have U.S. source income and you don't have a lot of assets? You're fresh out of school, but you want to relocate to the United States and you want to bring your spouse with you. Is there another way you can do it?
Co-sponsor.
Right, joint sponsor.
Yeah, joint sponsor. So you can find somebody, and there are requirements there, but they're not that stringent. It's the same financial requirement has to be met, but any U.S. citizen or U.S. permanent resident can act as that sponsor, can join in and provide assets or income to help meet the requirement.
Right, and that doesn't need to be a family member. It can be anybody.
It can be an employer,
acquaintance.
friend.
Yeah, anybody really. As long as they're willing to sign off on the form, and it's a lengthy form, and we're going to ask for some detailed financial information from this person.
Yeah,
so
they have to
can't
be
be
willing
shy.
to disclose their finances.
Willing to disclose their finances and willing to be on the hook for you, and they're willing to sign off, then they can be a joint sponsor. You just got to keep in mind, what's their household size like? If it's a family of 12 or 15, then that obligation is going to be a lot higher.
They make a lot more money.
Yeah,
to
they
sponsor.
do. Right.
The other thing too, and this also comes up quite often, is U.S. taxes. You as the sponsor have to be current in your taxes. You have to have filed your taxes on a regular basis. If you haven't, you need to go back and back file and show that either you filed or you weren't required to file. Your sponsor, co-sponsor, will also have to meet those obligations as well. So, and you have to provide them. They're looking back 3 years on tax returns. So if you haven't filed, you better go back and back file and get those up, make those current.
And you may not have to pay any money. Your tax obligation may be zero, but they want to see that you've done that filing.
You've met the obligation. And most of them don't have a tax obligation because they're paying in Canada.
Right.
And the tax rules protect them. But you have to have submitted your tax returns in the U.S.
So what if you don't have a joint sponsor? Say, for example, we get a lot of calls from U.S. citizens that have grown up in Canada, maybe were born in Canada to U.S. citizen parent, never lived in the U.S., don't have any family in the United States, but they really want to come and live in the U.S. and bring their spouse with them. Is there another way they can qualify without a joint sponsor?
Well, you can qualify on your assets or your spouse's assets.
Right. So then you can look at your spouse's assets. Maybe your spouse has assets, or maybe your spouse has U.S. source income. That's another way to look at it. And it happens.
That
once
only
in a while,
applies to a spouse.
Right.
So they only let you do that if it's a spouse that can go in and join that way.
You can use the intending immigrants' assets and income to. You can do it with other categories. I do believe. Maybe not.
No, only a spouse. You can only use intending immigrants' income as a spouse.
Okay. I've done it for a brother or sister.
You have?
Yeah. But we can edit that out.
You sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I thought it was only a spouse.
And one thing you need to keep in mind is if you're using the intending immigrant's income. So I had a case where
Start that over because I was talking while you talked.
Okay. So you can actually use the intending immigrant's U.S. source income to qualify, as opposed to the U.S. I had a case recently where it was a husband and wife. He was working in the United States on a visa. She was a U.S. citizen and sponsored him for his permanent residence in the United States while they were living in Chicago. And she didn't work. She was a stay-at-home mom. They had a couple kids, and she hadn't worked in years. So there you go. U.S. citizen has no income. They had no assets to speak of at the time. They were just living hand to mouth, and they used his income from his U.S. employer to qualify. The one caveat was that they needed USCIS requested a letter saying that from the U.S. employer saying that they were going to continue to employ him after he got his green card.
And you have to have been employed with that employer for at least 6 months too.
Right, and so, but the key is, because a lot of people are like, oh great, I'll just go ask my employer, my spouse can just go ask their employer to give a letter of that nature. Many employers are adverse to doing that because they think it gives them some kind of legal obligation to continue to employ you. So
I just did one like that.
It's not the easiest letter to get sometimes.
Yeah, the intending immigrant was on a TN visa.
Yeah.
The U.S. citizen spouse was not employed or did not even come close to the income requirement. But the TN visa holder, foreign spouse, had plenty of income. So we relied on her income to meet the income requirement because the U.S. citizen spouse did not meet it.
Yep. So there are ways to get around it. You just gotta, speak with someone who knows what they're doing. If yours isn't a straightforward case, just to make sure that you can meet all of the requirements before you start the process.
Yeah, and in dealing with these cases, these family relationships and sponsorship cases, I would say that this is probably one of the biggest holdups on these cases. They get it approved, like I said, at first stage, and they get to the National Visa Center and the U.S. Consulate, and then they find out, oh wait, there's a financial sponsorship requirement? Oh, how do I do this? And it's very confusing as to who can qualify and what you provide to show they qualify.
I know, I always think of that list on the form where they ask you, how many people are in your household. Calculate your household size. Even that list is confusing because it'll say the person you're sponsoring, and then you yourself, and then your spouse, and then you're thinking, well, the spouse is the person I'm sponsoring, so now I just put them down twice. Is the number 3 or is it 2?
Yeah.
So it can be very confusing. You want to make sure it's done right. If you don't do it correctly, they'll reject the form, or it's going to prolong your case as you try to struggle to get it in the right shape.
And because a lot of these individuals are living in Canada or another country and they're not in the U.S., one of the errors we often see is they put down their Canadian-based income, and they think that their Canadian-based income is going to qualify them, but it doesn't.
And many people want to send us their Canadian taxes too.
Can
I send you my Canadian tax
U.S.
return?
doesn't care about your Canadian taxes.
Nope, they don't care how much you paid or made in Canada.
Yeah, that's another. So we see that a lot. They'll send over Canadian-based income or Canadian taxes. Nope, it has to be U.S.-based. Yep. U.S. dollars, U.S. income, U.S. assets. Or if it's a foreign asset, it's equivalent in U.S. dollars.
Absolutely. So bottom line, I think, if you have one of those family members that can sponsor you and they're in the U.S. or maybe they're not in the U.S. but you think you qualify, it's good to speak to a qualified immigration lawyer, determine what your eligibility is, and just make sure if you have a choice between people sponsoring you, choose the one that's got the higher U.S. source income for best chance of approval.
Yeah, it's something you need to consider. Well, thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for listening. If you have any other questions about U.S. immigration law, whether it is sponsorship, whether you qualify financially, or any other U.S. immigration law related matters, that's all we do. We dedicate our practice to U.S. immigration law. If you haven't already, you can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Hit like. So that other people out there looking for or listening to similar things can find it as well. Thank you for listening and have a great day.